Hi, everybody. My name's Paul McGee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research here in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra. Lovely to see you all here. Okay, we're going to begin by acknowledging that we're here on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and to all Indigenous people present today. So today it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Claire Roslyn Wilson. Now, Claire comes to us as a holder of the Donald Horne Fellowship here in the CCCR, which is a yearly award for recent doctoral graduates, and it gives people the kind of time and institutional space in which to explore a further project, to continue their doctoral research, to embark on new projects. And you're going to hear about some of this work today. So Claire is a poet, a researcher, and an editor based in Barcelona. Claire develops video works that explore the unfamiliar, both in terms of unfamiliar places and cultures and the unfamiliarity of the more than human. Originally from Naarm, Melbourne, and having worked for periods in Thailand, Singapore, and now Barcelona, Claire is particularly interested in how creative practice can be an entry point into exploring the unfamiliar and the unknown in an open and curious way. So please join me in welcoming Claire to the stage.
Thank you. I would also like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and pay respect to elders past and present, and to pay respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people here today. I'd also like to thank the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research and Paul McGee for the warm welcome and for the time and space to continue my research from the PhD and just to have that space to explore in a really open way. So for the fellowship, I've been working on a practice-led research project that investigates the making and sharing of micro multimedia creative works to investigate familiar and unfamiliar places. And I call this the postcard exchange. And it's an exploration of place online exchanges in an interdisciplinary approach. So I'm kind of still in the process of all of this this research in a way. So I'd like to kind of present where I am at the moment. And I feel like I have many more questions than answers. So hopefully these questions might be interesting and open up a bit of a discussion. So I just thought I'd start by kind of positioning how I got to this place and why I'm kind of combining these elements. Maybe look at a few examples of similar platforms or collaborations that I'm looking at and some interviews that I've done, and then outline some of the collaborations that I've been working on as part of this project. So I started looking at this place and exploring ideas of place coming from a translocal and intercultural perspective. So as in my PhD, I was looking at translocal reflective practice, and particularly the kind of cultural assumptions or past experiences that we might bring with us when we adapt to a new place. And I think this was particularly influenced by my experience living in different places. And as I was doing the research, I was starting to live in Barcelona. So it was kind of this initial process of, how do you get to know a place? And it was quite focused on that. But I've been living in Barcelona now for about 6 years. And so as I was there, I started to see some of the tensions that are in a place like Barcelona that's very multicultural, has lots of migrants, lots of sort of short-term stays, long-term stays, and one of the big tensions that was sort of very obvious is the tension with mass tourism. And at the same time, I was thinking, as someone who can be mistaken for a tourist in Barcelona, sort of felt a bit uncomfortable. And I thought, well, I'm also do tourism as well. I travel to new places, and I could see that there's a value in exposing yourself to the unfamiliar. But then I thought, well, obviously mass tourism is not a good way to go about it. But then saying sort of get out seemed to be a bit of a simplistic response. And so then I started to think about, well, how can we travel more sustainably? How can we maybe slow down or do it more slowly, or kind of be more reflective in the places that we travel through, and kind of taking parts of my PhD research on reflective practice and seeing how that could be applicable to a case like Barcelona. And at the same time, I was involved in some projects, like one in Barcelona that was called Migrantur, which is a play on migrant and tour. So it's kind of looking at sustainable tourism in a way, but it was really about how to combat, or how to sort of address racism by telling stories of migrants to a city or to a neighborhood, particularly neighborhoods in cities like Barcelona that are very kind of touristy, and you have the sort of typical big monuments. How can you have migrants telling their story? So they tell about the neighborhood, but they also tell about their journey and their experience. And through this kind of individual relating to this migrant, this person who now calls this city home, and hearing their story, how can you kind of get a more nuanced picture of the city, but then also of the issues of migration? So that's kind of how I was sort of thinking about place. But I also work sort of in my day job, working as an editor and writer on a number of online platforms in the arts and culture. So one of them was particularly looking at artistic mobility. So it's a European network that looks at artist mobility, sort of sharing practical things like opportunities and news and good practice, but also sort of working as policy advocates for sort of advocating for the need for artistic mobility. And another one was looking at sort of bringing Asia and Europe together through artistic exchanges. So in both of these cases, what I found really interesting was that the more you look into all these people working across borders, there's so many great practices out there and so many great methods and ways of working. And I thought, well, how can these platforms are really important as ways to share this information and to kind of get inspiration in our creative practice. And another element that I sort of observed as I was working with these platforms is the way the online can kind of complement creative practice. So it can either help make it more sustainable, it can allow for more time. So a lot of particularly in one of the platforms in artistic mobility in Europe, in the European context, people are traveling, they've only got time for a week here, for a collaboration or residency. Then there's a lot of time pressure, and the development of partnerships takes time and takes relationship building and trust building. And so it was kind of looking at, well, how can we use sort of online tools to not take away the travel, but to kind of supplement these projects and kind of provide more time. But I'd also seen in some of these examples where they were doing projects bringing people together from Asia and Europe, where they tried to do this sort of online community building, that also just didn't kind of work. The people were too busy to sort of spend much time on it, or they were too focused on the project outputs. So I was kind of really interested in how it could open up access for people who can't travel as much, how it could be more sustainable, and how it could sort of support a creative practice. And then I also wanted to keep the interdisciplinary element as a video poet. It's something that I was very interested in personally. But I also saw it as a way to kind of bring together some of the complexities of encountering space and the familiar and the unfamiliar, sort of leaving space for juxtaposition between the image, the sound, the text, to create surprise and kind of keeping the fragments there as well. So what I was, so the project that I was working on I called the Postcard Exchange. So I wanted to create a framework for ephemeral moments and fragments of trying on other perspectives that could encourage a deeper sense of empathy when encountering place. So I had the idea that this could be a platform or an app or some kind of game framework where people are prompted to collect the visual, the audio from a certain place and write their own text about that in a reflective way. So I had these kind of rules that I thought could work, and I experimented in my own practice as a video poet to kind of make video poems of under a minute, collecting these things, kind of putting them together and seeing what will come out of it. And so the idea was to sort of move beyond just taking a photo of a place and moving on, but sort of making a bit more of a game experience or layered experience where you have to sit with the place or loiter with the place a bit longer, and try and encourage that reflective process through a creative, a little mini creative game that's not too arduous. But then I was also interested in having a sharing element. So I wanted to focus on the creative process rather than just commissioning a work and then kind of presenting it all and sort of saying, okay, these are all fragments of different places, and then someone kind of looks at them and observes and sort of sees these fragmented places. But I was wanting to think of ways of kind of inviting people into a creative process so that they too could play with this idea of how to encounter place. So I started to look at a number of platforms that did this in interesting ways, that engaged with creative process, engaging with being in place. So I'll just go through three that I've been looking at, and as I said, it's still something, a work in progress. So three that I've been talking to about how kind of how they've structured their engagement, how they've done community engagement, and the way that they engage with place. So one of them is Cities and Memory, which is a sound mapping project. One of them is called Over Here, which is pinning poetry on a map. And one of them is called Monday to Monday, which is an exchange between artists, one based in India and one based in Switzerland. So I'll start with Cities and Memory. So this is, it's a sound mapping project where it encourages people to record sound in a place, and people can also remix the sound. So it's kind of a two-step process. So they basically send in their sound with a story behind the place where they recorded or why they recorded it. And then the person who wants to remix the sound can choose whatever sound that they want to. And then they can either respond to the sound or they can respond to the story in some way. So the person who founded this had this idea that he was very interested in creating many perspectives on place, so that if you gave one sound to many people, you would come back with many different types of creative outputs. No? And so, yeah, so one of the reasons I found this so interesting was the multiple perspectives on place, and the creative process, so that the way that people engage creatively with space. So some people chose, they were more comfortable with developing work that was just in a place that they knew, whereas others were kind of more curious about the unknown. So they would sort of choose sound that came from somewhere else. And so, as I said, a very important element of that was kind of the story behind the sound. Another example is the Over Here app, which is more sort of pinning poetry on a place. So this is much more localized, whereas the Cities and Memory was sort of a global map. That was more kind of remote collaboration. So you'd sort of pick up a sound and then you'd sort of work on it. There wouldn't be the direct exchange. The Over Here app was sort of more commissioned work, so that they'd work either with festivals or partners or do poetry workshops to sort of think about how to write in place. And then this is pinned on maps mainly based in the UK. And it would be an immersive experience for the listener to kind of download the app, and as they walked into the place, then they would sort of hear the poetry in an immersive way. And so the idea was to kind of slow down moving through place and kind of staying with a place and kind of stopping the forward momentum and kind of reflecting more in place, which is sort of what I found very interesting about the Over Here app. And so one of the elements that they try and do with the Over Here app is get people into a sense of flow and sense of play. So they've set these parameters for how to engage with it. And then the idea is that creating this, they've sort of created a space or a sandpit for people to play. But then one of the challenges that they're finding with this is how to invite people in. So at the moment, it's very kind of localized. And it's kind of growing slowly and organically, which is helping them really define what they want to do with it. But when I was asking about, okay, so what if you kind of open it up for more public contributions as opposed to a commissioning process, they were like, oh, well, then you'd potentially get a whole lot of people sort of doing silly sounds and uploading it and, you know, calling it poetry or whatever. So he was sort of thinking about different ways of getting engagement or commitment from people who were wanting to contribute. So if you kind of open it up, maybe it would be a matter of kind of having them listen or go through various paths before they could create their own, and kind of having this idea of investment into the idea and the spirit of the app. And then another of the projects is Monday to Monday, which is an exchange between two artists, so one based in India and one based in Switzerland. And every Monday they exchange. They call it like an open or an online studio, where 1 week one will send something which can be sort of a visual, a text, a video about where they are and their practice and their kind of their space. And then the other person will respond. And they've put this on a blog. So the person who is receiving I don't want to call it content, but who's receiving the ideas, then kind of reviews it and decides what will then be put up on the blog. So it's kind of a process of re-looking, and then they have a discussion as well, which isn't included on the blog, but it's sort of a discussion that sort of comes out of these exchanges. And so they've been doing that since 2011. And as I was talking to them, they said, "Oh, we haven't missed a Monday." So I was really curious about how does this work? You know, how is there such a commitment to this exchange, and how has it lasted for so long? So one of the exchange kind of formed out of these two artists having met via a project, and they kind of they sort of just meshed in a way, or there was something that kind of connected and clicked, and they'd sort of kept in touch. But they thought, well, these kind of conversations, they're a bit loose. We want to do a project, but we're not really sure what. So they kind of created this structure of sending something Monday to Monday, but they kept it quite open about what they could send. And they sort of said it's like traveling. So I was kind of asking, well, what kind of insights do you get about place when you're kind of doing these exchanges, because you're from different areas, you know, how are you learning about another culture maybe, or what have you? And then they said it's kind of like traveling through the days and the weeks with somebody. So it wasn't necessarily sort of a cultural immersion, or it wasn't sort of a deep insight into a place, but it was sort of their daily life, and it was an entry point in a way. And the topics that they talked about were very kind of connected to where they were, but it was sort of a way of sort of accompanying someone, which I thought was quite interesting. And another thing which I thought was quite interesting for this was that they'd done an exhibition at one point, but they were sort of a bit ambivalent about the exhibition itself. So they said that the process of selecting what was to go in the exhibition was really interesting, because they'd sort of go past the previous topics and exchanges, and what they selected and put in was a great process. But the exhibition itself kind of disrupted the flow of the conversation. So then that kind of got me thinking in terms of my project and the other examples of the, you know, the process and the output, which I guess seems, you know, quite simple in a way, but in this instance, it was kind of an uncomfortable fit to have to sort of have an output of this process, because the process itself was so rich. And so one of them had said the exhibition didn't really give anything to the project. It was kind of a distraction and an annoyance in a way. So then it had me thinking about sort of who you're engaging and what the audience, the role of the audience or the importance of it. These two artists, and particularly Varsha, also do a lot of online collaboration. So another one of their collaborations is this one, La Suemo, which is a meeting place at the end of, online meeting space at the end of every month, or the last Sunday of every month. And again, it emerged out of a project, out of a network that they had, and they wanted to sort of create this online space of meeting. And I was kind of interested in this project as well, because I thought, well, it's like the Monday to Monday, but in a more expanded way. So the Monday to Monday also really works because they work in a similar way. They sort of have a similar rhythm with the way that they work and kind of approach, if you like. How does that work when you have more people and a bigger conversation and more factors in there? And so one of the things that they were talking about in this project is that in the beginning it was a bit, there was an administrative part or a facilitating part where, so, you know, someone had to organise the meetings, they had to decide who was presenting, what are the topics, and it sort of felt a bit arduous, and the conversations weren't like what they were having with the Monday to Monday project. But then it was when they decided to kind of do a project within this space that they started to get these more reflective or deeper conversations that sort of just grew themselves without this sort of having to push from a facilitator. So they had a sort of project that they're in the process of doing based around weather and what weather is like in each place, and they sort of do from one group of contributions is about the morning, and then the midday and the afternoon, so it's kind of quite loose and how they contribute. But it sort of gave them a chance for deeper conversations. So as I was looking at these examples, I was sort of looking at the structure of the engagement. So each of them had their rules and their sort of parameters to guide the contributions and the discussions. There was an element of play or entering into a flow state. And in some cases, there was a centering of the discussion around a concrete project more than just sort of meeting and having a discussion. The community involvement was sort of at times a challenge to invite people in. I think in the Cities and Memories example, when I was asking sort of how do you get people contributing to this, the founder was saying that it started with a really strong community of practice. So there was the sound recording community that really saw this is an interesting project that had a unique angle. And so they kind of jumped on board quite quickly. And then it kind of grew from there and from separate projects. So he had sort of very focused projects around cities and wellbeing or migration, for example, where you could sort of delve in a bit deeper and kind of have a bit more visibility around the project. But it was really a community of practice that was interested and engaged that really sort of took it off the ground. But there's definitely a need for time and investment. And so the challenge of how to sort of work out how you can interest people in that investment, how you can get them involved. And whether you need a community of practice to sort of support the development. And then I was also looking at the way that these platforms engaged with place. So in some cases, they were engaging with the stories of place, like in Cities and Memory, or the experience of listening and of kind of slowing down in place, which was, I think in a way the Over Here app, it's sort of also about, it's an app, so it's online, but you really have to be in the place, you know, it's not something that you can necessarily experience only online. And then there's the personal experience or introduction of place, or the entry point, or the cultural or the place facilitator who kind of introduces you and shows you around a place. So the next part of the research that I'm working on, I decided to collaborate with a few practitioners or artists who were in places that were unfamiliar to me. So I sort of felt like I had this idea of the practicalities of how I could do like a game-like structure. But I felt like I had a question of, how do I create these fragments or trying on of different perspectives that could encourage a deeper sense of empathy when encountering place. So I sort of felt like, well, at the moment, how about I put aside this idea of this structure that I have from my own creative practice and work with a bit of a testing out of this exchange with somebody as a way to focus on how it might work as opposed to what it might produce. So focus a bit more on the process. So I had this tension between creating the framework for a task-based participation and one that encourages creative play or trying on the perspectives. So I had done collaborations before, but it was more in a way of complementary skills. So I'd done a work with a sound artist. So I'd sort of created this poem or this concept or the idea for the poem, and then kind of passed it on to a sound artist who then sort of did the sound work for it, which I thought was a really nice output, and it kind of worked really well as a collaboration. But it felt, I wanted to kind of open up a collaboration that was more about the design of the project. So not just responding to sort of an output that I wanted to do, and kind of letting go of that authorial control, if you like, and to sort of develop it together. I've got a video poem here just to give an idea of sort of my practice, if you like.
The centre is drying, dying, dried out. This is a kind of life, freed from rooting. The click-clicking of the popping embolisms is quiet now. The whales are held within, against the wind, peppering sand, sea salt. So many years loitering on this strip, the sea hanging its plants on limbs to dry out between the tides. Too bent, too salty, too full of brittle grains, they sit on the edge, without a use, untiding the lines. Land, sand, sea. Bones left on the beach, dedicated to their clean, slow rot. Becalmed in the turns of the earth. They hold. After the last footprints are lost in the wind, after everything has become just another layer left buried, the world will spin, breathing lives.
So in a way, this was kind of an example of what I was thinking about, of resting and being in place and kind of processing that through juxtaposition of sound and text and reflection. And as an output, I was quite happy with it. But I thought, I was asking, well, what would happen? What would it look like, or what kind of framework or parameters would I do with working with somebody else? So that's why I wanted to open it up to a more sort of discovery through collaboration. So I'm going to be doing a residency in Split in Croatia in September, and I thought, well, what would it be like if I had an exchange with somebody before then? So you kind of have an encounter with the unfamiliar before you arrive, and then how would that sort of be an introduction or an entry point perhaps to my perceptions of Split. So I wanted to play with this idea of having an online exchange or a remote exchange to places that are unfamiliar, and what does that kind of come up, thinking about the framework of what this platform or app or whatever it might look like. So I was kind of matched up with an artist. So the curator in Split in Croatia said that Gloria is kind of looking at place and identity, and particularly through memory, and she works in moving image and with photography, and that she would be someone who's kind of open to this exploratory approach. So the kind of the brief or the description I sent to her was this idea of sharing place and reflecting on place, but with the aims to kind of foster a thoughtful exchange, to develop diverse perspectives about where we live, and to explore how this might work in an online space. So I left the output very open. I said, you know, it doesn't, I kind of work in video poetry, but it doesn't have to be that at the end. It doesn't have to be a video. We can have an exhibition. Ideally, it's through the creative process and creating together that we reflect on this, but it didn't have to have a particular look at the end. And that the time was quite open as well. So by the end of the year, we might have something, but to keep it sort of quite loose, thinking about the Monday to Monday example, for example. So the technology was very simple. So we just did sending to and fro with sort of emails and file transfers. We started it off with an online discussion where we could kind of get to know each other's practice. We talked about where we lived and what we knew about the other places. And I think the example between Split and Barcelona is quite interesting because they're often compared with each other, particularly in terms of mass tourism, and that some of the main streets are sort of compared as being the same. So that sort of was our starting point. So I would send her sort of not the big famous one, but things that were more local to my everyday. And then she kind of responded and said, oh, that's not what I thought Barcelona was like. And so then she sort of sent a video work about her memories of a place. So then it was sort of looking at, she sort of did the text remembering, and then went and visited it and sort of saw how it would change. And then as we're talking about a memory and kind of layered memory, and how that I sort of didn't really have the same kind of depth of memories of place in Barcelona, then I started to look at, you know, how we perceive place and how it's all kind of fragmented, which sort of led to this, my kind of layering of the images, and sort of I had a video that was merging between one image and another. And then that led to her kind of picking up more on the aesthetic of what I was doing as well. So she was quite interested in that layering of the images. So then she sort of was looking at the passage of time, moving very slowly from kind of one to another. It was, we were sort of responding to the visual aesthetic as well, in what we were sending, and kind of finding these kind of touch points between the two cities. And then I think that through the process, it also made us reflect. I mean, I'm not sure how much we've learnt or that we know about each other's places, but also was a reflection on where we are. So she would make the observation, oh, you know, I didn't realize there were so many, it was so green and everything in Barcelona, whereas I was like, oh, it's not green at all. So it kind of makes you sort of think about where you are in place. And so I think considering what we're choosing was a very interesting element as well, like what we would include. We were both consciously not looking for those really touristy places, and kind of looking more for the everyday, and also what kind of text and explanation we included in this I found really interesting as well, because we sort of almost had a desire to explain a bit more, but I think it was very interesting that some of it was kind of more meditative reflections about place, as opposed to saying this is the history of Split or this is the history of Barcelona. So it was kind of an interesting mix. So what kind of emerged out of it was these discussions on time and stillness, and the kind of a fragmented approach, and the sort of the aesthetic that we're kind of working with. And I think it was a way to kind of get to know each other's work, this very open approach. So then as the next stage, we're thinking of sharing less and like having more of a conversation between the images, working from place to place. Yeah, so it was more, I guess, personal insights of daily life and perspective than on necessarily the place itself, like the history or its culture or the wider society. It was a reflection on our own place and how we respond to them. It also took us to new places in our own cities. So we sort of had this challenge of going to find, what are we going to send to the other one? So it would take us out of our daily routines. And as I was talking to Gloria about it, she was saying, that it didn't feel like an arduous chore, that it was sort of a playful open space in a creative practice that was more sort of focused on projects and outcomes. So she quite enjoyed that openness of just kind of being able to explore and play. So I think in another collaboration that I'm sort of in the middle of as well, with an artist from Skopje, North Macedonia, with Darko, we've sort of had a slightly different exchange. So it's sort of been a bit more playful. So we've used WhatsApp because it's sort of a very quick exchange. And I think in the beginning, we were both a bit intimidated by what are we going to send? It has to be perfect, or I want it to look great or something. So I think the use of a very sort of quick communication medium was useful in breaking that sort of initial intimidation of what we send. And it sort of was a bit more, we kind of put a few more playful constraints around it. So we'd sort of say, okay, I'm going to take 100 steps, stop, and then take a picture of an object in my area. And so we sort of started with that, and particularly looking at objects around in the cities where we are. So it was kind of much more fragmented, but it led to sort of, I guess, more conceptual conversation. So then we're taking that to another sort of stage where we've created a bit of a construct or framework, I guess, of exchanging images, kind of can use text, but we're not allowed to explain what's in the image and things like that to sort of shape our exchange. So I just thought I'd finish with a few kind of reflections that are in mid phase. So one element which I found very interesting was kind of choosing what story to tell about place. That I found that there were personal entry points, say in the Monday to Monday project or the exchanges that I was doing, which was quite interesting in kind of opening up curiosity. And it kind of made me think about how I think about place in a way in that perhaps I'd taken it very much in the structure or the spatial awareness of a place. Whereas here it was also about the personal journeys and the personal stories that make up a place that I found quite engaging in a different way. But then I was also wondering, in terms of kind of taking it back to the idea of this platform, and a couple of platforms that I'd seen, one which I think is called Becoming Istanbul, which is sort of a whole lot of fragments in a mapping of Istanbul that I really like the concept of, but I don't kind of engage with as an audience as much, because I'm like, what am I looking at, and what is this fragment, and it's sort of, it's nice as a concept, and perhaps if you're involved in it, then you're sort of more interested. But then I was wondering, would someone on the outside find these exchanges as engaging as me? And I think it was the act of, I think everyone put a lot of time and consideration in these collaborations to really respond thoughtfully. And I think it was that process that really helped the reflection and made what we were sharing more interesting. So some of the other things about the framework of it was to keep it playful, to make up rules. And I think one thing that I found quite stimulating for the creative practice and for ways of engaging with place was to actually disregard a little bit my focus on video poetry. Because, for example, when I was working with Darko, he was saying, okay, one of the things that I did in a residency was I just refused to take an image of where I was going if I was going to use it in my creative practice. So then he had to keep going back to those places to remember it and to sort of keep it in his mind as opposed to holding it in an image, which I thought was a very interesting way of being able to reflect in place. So then I think these collaborations have sort of opened up the form and focus more on the intent of what I'm trying to do. So I feel like in some ways in the collaborations, the visual has still been quite dominant as sort of maybe a quick way in, which I thought was interesting, considering that I was quite interested in the sound elements as well. Although sound has been there and text has been there, the visual has been very much more dominant. So I found that quite interesting. So yeah, another area that I'm kind of reflecting on is how to invite people in, and this idea where I had sort of looked at the problem of over-tourism in Barcelona, and I thought, well, how can I sort of delve into this problem? And I thought, well, could it be a platform where you encourage a more general audience to engage in this creative play so that they can then sort of slow down and sort of reflect more in place? But I think that's a very challenging ask, which I knew at the time as well. But then I'm sort of looking at communities of practice potentially as a starting point, as opposed to sort of a general audience. But yeah, so something I'm reflecting on. And so instead of kind of thinking about the mechanics of how to frame this idea, so you know that you need the moving image and you need audio and it needs to be collected in space, or that you've got to attach a story to it, I was thinking more about the concept or the idea behind this structure, perhaps. So I think what I found, particularly with the collaborations, is that we're listening and responding with care. So I sort of wanted that to be sort of part of the concept behind this. Embracing uncertainty and incompleteness. So I think this openness of the collaborations has been very useful for the discussions and for everyone feeling like they can direct it. Taking time for discovery and this idea of play and the playfulness of it, I think, has still been quite important. Yeah, I feel like letting go of the idea to know a place in a certain way has been interesting. So I sort of have always, as I was going through this, I'm like, oh, should I read a historical thing about this place? You know, should I be looking at how do you get to know a place? And I think it's very complex and multi-layered, and this is just one entry point, no? But there's this idea of knowing a place. I'm like, oh, I just know it through this one person that's very biased. Of course it's biased, but it's an interesting way in, and you don't stop there. But this idea of like, oh, there's so much I don't know was kind of in the back of my mind, and I had to let that go and just go with it a bit more. Yeah, and following the curiosity. So I think I'll leave that there. I've sort of thrown out a lot of ideas, and I'm not sure if it's very coherent, but I hope it's got some interesting questions there.
Thanks so much, Claire. That was really lovely and thoughtful. I just felt this sense of a sort of a space opening up as we're sitting here, where we could just dwell and not quite know where these ideas go, but really fascinating, thought-provoking material. I'm going to open things up for questions and comments, firstly from people in the room. So would anyone like to make a comment, ask a question?
I don't even know where to start, Claire. So that's wonderful. And after this, it'd be great to catch up, because I have been working in this space around creativity and play and well-being. So I just have 1,000 questions for you. But let's just do one simply, which is, because you talked about Gloria's sense of playfulness and play as part of this project, but you didn't talk about your own. And I'd be curious to see what your subjective experience of play was during this, and what it gave to you, and where you felt like there were constraints around it for you as well in terms of artistic practice.
Yeah, so I think one of it was kind of sending me out, exploring in a way, or seeing the place new, and choosing what kind of fragments of that to take and to share. So I think the sharing really guided the playfulness. Like, I was sort of feeling in some ways a bit jaded by the spaces, you know, as you do with everyday life. You know, whereas I think it was sort of like having her there beside me as I was re-looking at places, which I found quite fun. And I also found opening up of my own practice to different aesthetics or different ways of doing was really fun and kind of stimulating as well. So what I mentioned about the not using the images, and then I'm like, oh, well, maybe it's another way of doing it, or even the technical aspect of how Gloria was moving from one image to the next, which I hadn't considered. So the way I was trying to reflect the change of memory was sort of layering, where she was moving from one to the other, and the impact that had when I saw it, I was like, wow, that's amazing. And then I could see where that could go with our collaboration, moving between place, and sort of when you're on the next image, you've already forgotten what's before. And I felt that was like more kind of more effectively created this idea of place, you know, how place changes without you even realizing. So I think those, the sort of the discovery in a place which is overly familiar, and also the technical approaches or aesthetics were the two areas that I found very interesting.
Great, thank you. Can I be greedy and ask one more question? So from there, I know you're kind of mid-process, and I think you're starting to articulate it just then and also through your presentation, but what mechanisms, like, are you identifying, like, that are of play that are effective both for like creative practice? So if you wanted to extend on what you've already said, if there's anything else left, because I was thinking about that all the way through, and particularly, so both your project and all the other projects that you have there, there are definitely narratives and themes that are coming through there about what play can and also what play can't do. So I'd be curious to go back to what it can't do from your perspective. Oh, I've just completely lost my track. That's enough. That will do.
Yeah, and I think it's really messy at the moment, because there's, I guess, also part of the work that I do with the online platforms is sharing information. So I know that there are so many great things out there. So one of my temptations is, oh, well, maybe what's needed is like bringing together different ways to play in place, and having like a toolkit, or sort of gathering all these great practices and saying, this is a way to do it, and this is a way, and these are like different parameters that I've been working on in the collaborations to say, okay, 100 steps in an object, that's one play, and then kind of just putting them all there in a mapping, or in kind of getting everyone on board to sort of play in that space. So that's one thing that I'm kind of tempted to do as like an output. But then I also see that some of the work done in workshops, say in the Over Here app, sort of getting people out writing about space, or their place, and then having this immersive experience, and then taking that to different workshops in different places, I think is a really great model as well. So I sort of see, and each of them in a way have taken the online into real life in different ways, in exhibitions, in kind of the immersive exhibition between where people can move between the recorded sound and the remix, and how that sort of, they can be their own kind of mover in that. And I thought that was a great thing as well. So I can sort of see ways like the collaboration that I'm doing, how it could be an exhibition and have outputs as well, but sort of, yeah. So I'm not sure which way it will go.
Yeah, fair enough. And just about where play ends, that final question. So what play can't do that you've discovered along this, thus far?
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting one. I don't think I've asked myself that yet. It sort of feels very, I guess, unfinished, and I mean, my first sort of thought is that it's unfinished and in process, and you can like leave it there and move on to the next thing. So I think it kind of needs a follow-up in some way. But it's a question to kind of reflect on, I think.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Claire. I'm working in the field of heritage studies, and I was almost thinking, as you've been talking through today, that heritage studies is almost the antithesis of what the kind of stuff you're doing, in that it's so invested in knowing place to the nth degree through a system of valuing place and inscribing importance and significance, that it kind of loses the everyday. So I kind of thought it was a great kind of contrast in my head. But then it has also made me think, coming back to your first slide about tourists go home, is that because of the way heritage does things, and it creates like World Heritage and national lists, it then creates this kind of focal points for tourism. And it seemed to me that what you're doing offers a shift for people to kind of be thinking about, individual and personalized experiences of place that wasn't obsessed by seeing the pyramids and seeing the Eiffel Tower and seeing, you know, Columbus's statue in Barcelona or whatever. So it's not really a question, but it was just kind of a reflection of what you're saying. And thanks very much.
Yeah, and I think the initial idea or way of thinking was guided by my personal practice of looking at the everyday as well. So I think there's a place for looking at the knowledge or the depths or the layers of what's there and the heritage that's there. But I guess I was feeling like that was overemphasized in certain spaces. And I guess in the case of Barcelona, they're looking at ways to kind of engage people in different spaces in the city and say, this is equally interesting, you know, but I can appreciate that it's not going to have the wow factor that, say, when a Sagrada Familia, that big church thing, is going to have. And that's really important as well as a cultural part of the city. I think, yeah, I was kind of, I was in the Split example as well. Someone who sort of lives between there and Barcelona is working on a project or a tour around Split, which is like an alternative tour where they look at places that don't exist anymore in the physical, particularly as the centre is, this lovely heritage centre is being overtaken by trashy tourist shops, and that this used to be, you know, someone's local butcher that was there for ages and ages or whatever. So he would do a tour of all the places that don't exist anymore, which I think is an interesting, sort of, that got me sort of mulling things as well. Like, what could this work through hearing stories of things that aren't there anymore, or the different stories of the heritage of the city in different ways. I don't know. I'm not sure if that's a response, but.
Oh, thank you. I think you mostly answered it. It was actually building on Steve's question and looking right at your original thing about go away tourists, and how do you think your work, tough question, how do you think your work will tackle that with the mass tourism?
Yeah, I mean, I think engagement is a real problem there, because they don't have the time or the interest necessarily to engage with this. And that's why I was sort of thinking about play as a kind of a way in, a fun way in. And also why I was actually thinking about the form of the video poem as being sort of moving image and sound, and sort of like, if I could work on a playful way where you could do that, which takes a bit longer than taking an image, but could engage sort of a mass tourist in, oh, look, I've made this video and then I upload it, and it's kind of something a bit different to do in Barcelona. But the side fact would be that you've made them, or not made them, but you encourage them to go somewhere else, or you've encouraged them to stay and watch it for a minute longer than they ordinarily would. So that was kind of how I would see as addressing that problem. I don't know how to reach those people, which I think is the challenge. So I think the concept is interesting, but then how do you, I guess you could try by getting the tourism board on board and kind of putting it at points where, you know, where they go for the information, they say, oh, this is.
Absolutely, because you've got the whole push for sustainable tourism and sustainability, and a lot of people who might go on mass tourism are also really keen to be sustainable and be more conscious of what they do and how they do it. So yes, there will be opportunities, I'm sure, if that's the way you wanted to go.
Yeah, and I think what the original idea was to kind of share these views as well, so that you could sort of share it with the locals and say, okay, they're not all just mass tourists, that, you know, maybe they've got something interesting to see about this city as well. So the idea was, that's why I had this sharing and why I wanted to try with the collaborations to see how to share, because I think that's a very important element of it, not just putting something out or not just flicking through the videos, but to sort of have this exchange between groups that are a bit at loggerheads.
Yeah, as a comment on this discussion, I was thinking during the presentation that, so you're creating an artwork, although it's quite an unusual one in that it's so focused on process, you know, as opposed to the end product. But maybe what's transpiring this is the possibility that travel could itself be a kind of artwork. You know, because in some ways what you're doing with these postcard exchanges is traveling prior to the trip. Maybe it's going to contour what the trip is. You know, maybe the trip could even disappear and you would have already traveled. Like, so I just want to pose that idea of travel as an art form in its own right, or maybe it always has to be a potential art form, because there's so many ways in which it cannot be artistic. But I just want to raise that as a possibility and see what you think.
And I think that was sort of one of the things in the back of my mind, like I know that there's a lot of limitations with online and that you can't really get to know a place, but I thought, well, can it make us reflect on travel and where we go and why we go, and maybe we don't go as a result as well. And maybe it's about entry points. So like in the cities and memory, I find that a really interesting entry point to a place where you think, okay, I'll have a look at where I think I want to go, listen to all the sounds. Oh, maybe I don't like that, but maybe I really like this sound. And that's the reason that I go to that place. Or in these conversations, I was talking to someone else who was saying, oh, I only want to go to places where I know people. So if you set up this postcard exchange, could that then mean, okay, that's why I decide to travel to this place? And because I actually want to have a conversation, maybe I'm going to stay there longer, or I don't know. So it was kind of, yeah, this idea of how it might change the way or help people reflect on the traveling itself. But I think that's
Fantastic.
Or indeed the postcards themselves as travel. So having these arrangements, because we now have a whole pile of arrangements around travel where you rent somebody else's house, or and there's lots of ways of traveling now. And so one of the other modes that you might hear is a kind of more playful engagement where people can actually travel. People who don't have time, who can't afford it, because we're all time poor. Many of us are time poor, and many of us are actually struggling with the cost of living. So what a great way to be able to to open up opportunities for being able to travel through these postcards, because of course you can't access that everyday experience when you just decide, oh, I want to check out Croatia, so I'll just do a scan, and you see the same things over and over again, or Barcelona. But this actually gives you that entry point that you would love to have if you could, if you were there, and you would take the opportunity to go and find those. And in fact, you can sort of have that, and then also meet somebody who can, who's basically your tour guide, but through their own lens. Yeah.
Okay, well, we might bring things to a kind of temporary pause there. And please join me now in thanking Claire for a delightful presentation.